There's a photograph sitting in a storage locker in upstate New York. It shows 43 people standing in front of a brick building with barred windows. They're not smiling. They're not posing. Most of them are staring at nothing. The photo was taken in 1937 at Willowbrook State School, and here's what makes your blood run cold. Not one person in that photograph ever left that building alive. Not through the front door. Not with their name intact. Not in any way that mattered. This isn't a story about a hospital. It's a story about American families who made a choice, signed a piece of paper, and then spent the rest of their lives pretending that choice never happened. It's about locked wards in buildings that still stand today, where patients were admitted with conditions as simple as epilepsy or depression and were never, ever discharged. Where the word patient became a polite lie for prisoner. Where treatment meant experimental surgery, isolation cells, and medical records that read like confessions from a war crime trial between 1900 and 1970. Over 500,000 Americans were institutionalized in state psychiatric facilities. The official discharge rate for long-term patients in many of these facilities was less than 8%. That means 9 out of 10 people who walked through those doors died inside. Some lived there for 60 years. Some forgot their own names. Some were children when they arrived and elderly strangers when they were finally buried in numbered graves behind the building. The locked ward wasn't just a wing of a hospital. It was a place where America hid the people it didn't want to see, the inconvenient, the difficult, the different. Families were told it was for the best. Doctors called it progressive medicine. The state called it public health. But the patients, the ones who could still speak, called it something else entirely. They called it the place where you go to disappear, and the most terrifying part. Most of these institutions kept meticulous records, admission logs, treatment notes, death certificates, which means we know exactly who was sent there, why they were sent, and what was done to them in the decades between the signature and the burial. We know their names. We know their faces. And we know they were never supposed to be remembered. The process of disappearing someone in America was shockingly simple. It didn't require a trial. It didn't require proof of danger. In most states, it required 2 signatures, a family member and a physician, and a single word on a form. That word could be anything: melancholia, hysteria, feeble-mindedness, moral insanity. These weren't medical diagnoses. They were social verdicts. And once that paper was signed, the person named on it ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Take the case of Anna Agnew, admitted to the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane in 1902 at age 19. Her admission form lists her condition as excessive reading and religious excitement. Her father, a Presbyterian minister, told the intake doctor that Anna had become difficult to manage after finishing school. She asked too many questions. She wanted to attend university. She argued with her brothers at the dinner table. The physician wrote hysteria with delusional features in the diagnosis box, and Anna was escorted to the women's ward. She would spend the next 41 years inside that building. She died there in 1943, blind and unable to speak. Her death certificate listing cause as chronic institutionalization. She was never violent. She was never treated. She simply stopped being Anna Agnew and became patient 28047. The intake process was designed to feel clinical, official, permanent. Families were told they were doing the right thing, that their loved one would receive the best modern care, that visits were discouraged during the adjustment period, which often lasted months or years. By the time families were allowed to visit, the person they'd admitted was often unrecognizable, drugged into compliance, hollow-eyed from isolation, terrified of saying the wrong thing because punishment in these places wasn't just physical, it was the threat of never leaving, of being moved to the back wards, the buildings where even the staff didn't want to go, where patients lived in their own filth because there weren't enough attendants, and the attendants who were there had stopped seeing them as human. What's documented in these admission records is a portrait of a society that weaponized medicine against anyone who didn't fit. Women who refused to marry, men who couldn't hold jobs during the Depression, children who had seizures, immigrants who didn't speak English, gay men and women who were reported by their own families, the elderly whose relatives wanted their property. The admission forms are horrifyingly honest. Wife is willful and refuses household duties. Son shows unnatural affection toward other boys. Patient laughs inappropriately and sees visions. Written about a 14-year-old girl who was later discovered to have been suffering from an untreated ear infection that caused hallucinations. Once you were inside, the burden of proof flipped. You weren't innocent until proven ill. You were ill until proven normal, and normal was whatever the doctor decided it meant on any given day. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The locked ward had its own geography, its own rules, its own sick logic that made sense only to the people who designed it. Most institutions were built in the Kirkbride style, massive Victorian structures with wings spreading out from a central administration building like the arms of a crucifix. The idea was therapeutic architecture, that sunlight and fresh air would heal the mind. But in practice, the further you walked from that central building, the further you walked from anything resembling therapy. The back wards, the chronic wards, the buildings for the hopeless cases, those were where America's disappeared lived and died in conditions that would make a prison warden quit. A typical day for a long-term patient in the 1930s and 40s began at 5 in the morning. Wake up was a bell or a night attendant banging on the dormitory doors. 50 to 80 patients sleeping in a single room, beds 3 feet apart, sometimes closer, no privacy. No personal belongings except what could fit in a small box under the bed, and even that could be confiscated without warning during security inspections. That were really just theft. Patients dressed in identical institutional clothing, gray or white cotton shifts for women, coarse trousers and shirts for men. Everything labeled with a number, not a name. Breakfast was served in a dining hall that smelled like boiled vegetables and disinfectant. Food was whatever the state provided at the lowest possible cost. Oat braid, watered down milk. Vegetables from the institution's own farm, worked by patient labor that was called occupational therapy, but was actually unpaid forced work. Patients grew the food, cooked the food, cleaned the buildings, did the laundry, maintained the grounds. The institutions couldn't have functioned without this labor, and the patients saw none of the money their work generated. After breakfast, the day stretched out in a suffocating routine. For some, there was genuine occupational therapy. Basket weaving, simple crafts, meaningless busy work meant to keep hands moving and minds from thinking too hard about where they were. For others, especially those in the chronic wards, the day meant sitting, just sitting. Rows of patients in chairs along the walls of a day room, staring at nothing because there was nothing to stare at. No books, no radio, no windows in many of the back buildings because windows meant risk, meant patients might see the outside world and remember they were once part of it. Staff was desperately understaffed. One attendant for every 40 or 50 patients was common. These weren't trained nurses. They were often people who couldn't find other work, paid poverty wages to control human beings who had been deemed uncontrollable. The job attracted some who genuinely wanted to help, but it also attracted sadists, people who enjoyed having power over the powerless. And there was no oversight. What happened in the locked ward stayed in the locked ward. If a patient was found bruised, they'd fallen. If a patient stopped eating, they were being difficult. If a patient died unexpectedly, well, they were mentally ill. What did you expect? The word treatment gets used a lot in the medical records from these institutions, but you have to understand what that word actually meant behind locked doors where nobody was watching. It didn't mean therapy in any sense we'd recognize today. It meant control. It meant punishment dressed up in medical language. It meant doctors with God complexes and state funding using human beings as laboratory animals to test theories that had no basis in science, only in desperation and career ambition. Hydrotherapy was one of the gentler terms. It sounds almost spa-like until you read the actual procedure notes. Patients were placed in bathtubs of ice, cold water for hours, sometimes days, with only their heads above the surface. Canvas covers were locked over the tubs so they couldn't get out. The theory was that shock to the system would calm psychiatric symptoms. The reality was that patients emerged hypothermic, sometimes frostbitten, occasionally dead from cardiac arrest, or the opposite. Prolonged hot baths, temperatures raised until patients lost consciousness, their bodies kept submerged until staff decided the treatment was complete. One nurse's log from Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts describes a patient who was kept in a hot bath for 11 consecutive hours and had to be carried back to the ward because she could no longer walk. The note ends with, "Patient remains agitated, treatment to be repeated." Then there was insulin shock therapy. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin to induce comas, sometimes dozens of comas over weeks or months. The idea was that bringing someone to the edge of death and pulling them back would somehow reset their brain. What it actually did was cause permanent neurological damage, seizures, and in many cases, death. But it was cheap, it was easy to administer, and it gave the appearance of aggressive modern treatment, which is what families wanted to believe was happening when they signed those admission papers. Electroshock therapy became wildly popular in the 1940s. Electrodes attached to the temples, electrical current sent directly into the brain to trigger grand mal seizures. No anesthesia in the early years. Patients were awake, strapped to tables, their bodies convulsing so violently that bones broke. Fractured vertebrae were common. Memory loss was expected and considered an acceptable side effect. Some patients received electroshock hundreds of times. The record at one institution was a man who received over 300 treatments across 6 years. His final medical note reads, "Patient no longer recognizes own name or face in mirror. Treatment discontinued." But the most horrifying treatment was the one that was supposed to be the miracle cure, the lobotomy. Between 1936 and 1967, over 40,000 Americans had their brains surgically mutilated in the name of psychiatric medicine. The transorbital lobotomy, perfected by Dr. Walter Freeman, involved driving an ice pick through the eye socket into the frontal lobe and scrambling the neural tissue. It took 7 minutes. It required no operating room. Freeman traveled the country in a van he called his lobotomobile, performing the procedure in state hospitals, sometimes 20 patients in a single day. The before and after photos are nightmare fuel. People who went in anxious or depressed came out as living ghosts, empty-eyed, drooling, unable to feed themselves. They weren't cured. They were erased. And here's the thing that makes your stomach turn. Families often consented to this. They were told their loved one would come home better. What came home, if anything came home at all, wasn't a person anymore. It was a breathing body with everything that made them human surgically removed. The children's wards are where this story stops being about misguided medicine and becomes something else entirely. Something you can't explain away with different times. Or they didn't know better. Because they did know. The doctors knew. The administrators knew. The state officials who signed the funding checks knew. And they did it anyway, to children who had no voice, no advocates, no way to fight back. Willowbrook State School on Staten Island was supposed to be a developmental center for children with intellectual disabilities. By the 1960s, it housed over 6,000 children in a facility designed for 4,000. They slept in cribs pushed so close together you couldn't walk between them. They wore no clothes because there wasn't enough staff to dress them or change them. They lived in their own waste. Hepatitis was so rampant it was considered endemic, just part of life at Willowbrook. And here's where it gets worse. Doctors at Willowbrook deliberately infected newly admitted children with hepatitis to study the disease's progression. They fed them extracts made from the feces of infected patients. They called it research. They published papers about it in medical journals. They built careers on it. And the children, some as young as 3 years old, had no idea they were being used as test subjects in experiments that violated every ethical standard of medicine. But Willowbrook wasn't unique. Penhurst State School in Pennsylvania, Rosewood Center in Maryland, Fernald State School in Massachusetts, where children were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of a study funded by Quaker Oats and MIT. The consent forms sent to parents didn't mention radiation. They said the children were joining a science club and would get special food. The children thought they were being rewarded for good behavior. They were being poisoned for data. These weren't children who were violent or dangerous. Most were admitted because they had Down syndrome or cerebral palsy, or they'd been born to unwed mothers who couldn't keep them. Some were admitted because they scored poorly on IQ tests administered in English to immigrant children who didn't speak English. One girl was sent to Penhurst at age 7 because she was deaf and her parents didn't know sign language. She spent 41 years there. When she was finally released in the 1980s, she had no language at all anymore. She'd forgotten how to communicate in any form. The isolation had taken even that from her. The mortality rate in children's institutions was staggering. At some facilities, 1 in 4 children admitted before age 10 died before reaching adulthood. Causes of death were listed as pneumonia, infection, seizure, heart failure, but the real cause was neglect. It was lying in a crib for 16 hours a day with no stimulation. It was malnutrition because there weren't enough staff to feed everyone. It was being left in scalding bathwater by an overworked attendant who was managing 30 children alone. It was being forgotten, and the graves, God, the graves. Behind almost every one of these institutions, there's a cemetery, small headstones, if there are headstones at all. Most are just numbered markers. Patient 4019, patient 5447, rows and rows of numbers in fields that have gone wild because no one tends them anymore. Because the children buried there had no families who claimed them, or the families who'd sent them away spent decades pretending those children had never existed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you found out your grandmother had a sister who was sent away and never spoken of again? If you discovered your family tree had a branch that ended in a numbered grave behind an asylum? The patients themselves left behind evidence. Not much, because paper and pencils were contraband in most locked wards, and mail was heavily censored or simply never sent. But some letters got through. Some diaries were hidden and survived. Some testimonies were recorded years later by the few who made it out alive. And what they describe isn't a hospital. It's a kingdom of casual cruelty, where the worst thing you could do was tell the truth about what was happening to you, because that truth would be written down as proof you were still crazy. Elizabeth Packard was committed to Jacksonville Insane Asylum in Illinois in 1860 by her husband, a minister who disagreed with her religious views. She was legally sane by any measure, but married women had no rights. Her husband's signature was enough. She spent 3 years inside, and when she was finally released, she wrote a book called The Prisoner's Hidden Life that documented what she witnessed. Women strapped to beds for months, patients beaten with leather straps for speaking out of turn, a woman who died after being locked in a closet-sized room for 6 days without food or water because she'd complained to a visiting official about conditions. Elizabeth's account was published in 1868, and it changed nothing. The same abuses continued for another 100 years. In 1948, a patient named Charles Pilgrim smuggled out a letter from Hudson River State Hospital in New York. It was found decades later in the archives, never delivered. He wrote, "I have been here for 9 years and I no longer remember what I was admitted for. The doctors do not speak to me. The attendants do not speak to me. I am beginning to believe I am not here at all, that I died and nobody told me. If you receive this letter, please tell my sister I existed. Tell her I was real. There's no record of Charles Pilgrim ever being discharged. His death certificate, filed in 1956, lists his cause of death as general debility, which is medical language for gave up and died." Anna Agnew, the woman we talked about earlier, kept a diary on scraps of paper she collected from the hospital office where she was sometimes allowed to work. She hid the pages inside a hymnal in the chapel. The diary was discovered during demolition in 1994. In it, she describes a ward where women who menstruated were isolated in a separate room and given no supplies, forced to sit on newspapers. She describes a patient named Catherine who was dragged to the basement and locked in a standing cage for 3 days after she tried to mail a letter to her mother. She describes the sound of screaming from the hydrotherapy rooms and how new patients always asked what that sound was and how after a few months they stopped asking because they already knew. One entry dated July 4th, 1927 reads, "Today is Independence Day. Through the window I can see fireworks over the town. I have been here 25 years. I am 44 years old. I do not know what I did to deserve this, but I must have done something terrible because God does not abandon the innocent. I try to be good. I try to be quiet. I try to be whatever they want me to be. But I think the truth is they do not want me to be anything. They want me to be gone without the inconvenience of being dead." These voices, the ones that survived, they're not asking for pity, they're stating facts. They're bearing witness to a system that treated human beings like livestock, that warehoused the inconvenient and called it medicine, that built monuments to cruelty and carved and charity above the doors. The patients knew exactly what was being done to them. They just had no power to stop it, and no one on the outside believed them when they tried to speak. The institutions started closing in the 1970s and 80s. Not because of some great moral awakening, not because society suddenly decided that warehousing human beings was wrong. They closed because they were expensive. Deinstitutionalization was sold as progressive reform, as patients being released into community care. But there was no community care. There was no infrastructure. There was no plan. Thousands of people who'd spent decades inside locked wards were simply turned out onto streets they didn't recognize, into a world that had moved on without them, with a bottle of pills and a voucher for a halfway house that didn't exist. The buildings themselves stand empty now, huge Gothic structures rotting from the inside out, windows broken, walls covered in graffiti, hallways full of scattered medical records and restraint chairs and rusted bed frames. Urban explorers go inside with cameras and call it creepy, call it haunted. They take pictures of the decay and never think about what made these places haunted in the first place. It wasn't ghosts. It was what living people did to other living people in rooms that were supposed to be about healing. Some former patients are still alive. They're in their 70s, 80s, 90s now. Most won't talk about what happened to them. The shame is too deep, the trauma too complete. But a few have spoken in oral history projects and documentaries that almost nobody watches. They describe being released after 30, 40, 50 years inside and not knowing how to cross a street, how to order food, how to exist in a world with choices. They describe nightmares that never stop. They describe the moment they realized that nobody was coming to apologize, that there would be no reckoning, that the doctors who mutilated their brains had retired with pensions, and the administrators who starved them had moved on to other jobs, and the families who abandoned them had died without ever saying the names they'd spent lifetimes trying to forget. There were a few investigations, a few scandals that made headlines for a week. The Willowbrook exposed by Geraldo Rivera in 1972 showed the country what these places really looked like, and the country was horrified for about 6 months before moving on to the next story. Some lawyers filed lawsuits. A handful of facilities were shut down by court order. But nobody went to prison. Nobody was held accountable. The official response was that everyone involved had been doing their best with the knowledge they had at the time, which is a lie that gets told when the truth is too expensive to face. The graveyards behind these institutions are still there. Most are overgrown now, forgotten. Some have been turned into parks where people walk dogs and have no idea they're walking over the unmarked graves of children who died from medical neglect in the 1950s. A few have been excavated by historians and archaeologists who are trying to give names back to the numbers, trying to contact descendants, trying to create some kind of record that says these people existed, they mattered, they were not nothing. But here's what keeps you up at night. The system that created these places, the logic that said some people are disposable, that said inconvenience is a medical condition, that said families have the right to disappear their own, that system didn't die when the institutions closed. It just found new forms. It's in the way we still warehouse the elderly in understaffed nursing homes. It's in the way we criminalize mental illness and fill prisons with people who need treatment. It's in the way we still, even now, decide that certain lives are less valuable, less worthy of care, less deserving of being seen. The locked ward isn't gone. We just stopped calling it that. And the patients who were never discharged, they're still teaching us something if we're willing to listen. They're teaching us that cruelty doesn't need monsters. It just needs ordinary people who are willing to look away, to sign a piece of paper, to tell themselves that someone else will handle it, that it's not their problem, that the people behind those locked doors probably deserve to be there anyway. The photograph from the beginning of this story, the one with 43 people who never left, it's still in that storage locker, still waiting for someone to claim it, to name the faces, to tell their stories. But nobody's coming, because the families who could have claimed it spent generations pretending those people never existed, and now everyone who knew them is dead. All that's left is a photograph of ghosts who were never allowed to haunt anyone, who disappeared so completely that even their absence was erased. That's the real horror. Not that it happened, but that we let it be forgotten.